Hello, world. This is the Know Your Place podcast, and we're on episode 32. I'm recording the lazy man's way again. I'm live streaming without actually announcing that I'm live streaming. So, anyway, on this week's episode, I thought I would talk about something I have personal experience with. So, yeah, I'm going to talk about hurricanes. Uh, I'd like to take a moment to say it's a real tragedy. Anyone loses their lives in hurricanes, and I think the death toll's at 20 with Hurricane Florence, and it's a real shame. And my heart goes out to all the loved ones, who've lost someone in this hurricane. But yeah, so this week I wanted to talk about how we have this hurricane hitting North Carolina. Well, I lived through two hurricanes when I lived in North Carolina. So for everyone who doesn't know, when I was approximately from 5th grade to 8th grade. I lived in North Carolina. Not 5th grade. What am I talking about? From 2nd grade to 8th grade, I lived in North Carolina. Ha! No, from 1st grade to 8th grade, I lived in North Carolina. There we go. I knew I'd get it right eventually. And I lived in Raleigh, North Carolina. Now, Raleigh is becoming one of the most major cities in the United States now, and it has a population of almost 450,000 now. But when I lived there, it was 350,000. So that just goes to show you how fast it's been growing. And yeah, it's the capital of North Carolina, so there's always a lot of flurry and activity about. And it's part of what they call the Triangle area with Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill, all three cities having major universities. Raleigh had North Carolina State University, Chapel Hill has the University of North Carolina, and Durham has Duke University. So it's a very important metropolitan area with lots of things happening, and it's always been sort of a technological hotbed, and things just keep happening there. Well, anyway, when I lived there, well, when we moved there, my family moved there from Wisconsin, so you can imagine it was quite different. It was very, very different. This move, and I think I talked about that in the first couple episodes of my podcast. But yeah, so we moved out there, and shortly upon arrival, a hurricane hit town. Yeah. So now Raleigh, when I say hurricane hit town, I mean Raleigh is 3 hours inland, so it's not like being on the very edge, worrying about the ocean coming in and just washing you away. But it was still very frightening for me as a young kid because the Fran hit North Carolina, it was still a category. I think it was still a Category 3 or Category 2 hurricane. Now, most hurricanes die off before they actually finally hit land. That's what a lot of people don't remember. They just remember seeing them at their biggest total number, like 5, when they're out in the ocean. But when they hit land, they generally die off. Fran had stayed quite powerful. In fact, it was so powerful that when it hit land, it was inside the eye. When it hit Wilmington, it was snowing. Can you imagine that? The just intensity of the weather for it to be raining and storming and then snowing in the middle of the storm. It was a very powerful storm. And so we lived 3 hours inland, and there's of course serious flooding and winds, but it made it all the way to where we lived, and it knocked out power for 2 weeks. Imagine that, for 2 whole weeks. I mean, granted, power outages from disasters seem to be more common, I think, back when I was a kid than they are now. Lots of people have generators. People from all over the country seem to come quickly and throw up power lines as fast as they can. But yeah, when I lived there, the power was knocked out for 2 weeks, and we were inland. We were 3 hours inland. So you can imagine how much more people struggled out in eastern North Carolina picking up from that storm. And I think it was at the time a $5 billion cleanup effort, that was a lot of money at that time. Anyway, so It was really bad. I remember we went inside the inside bathroom. We didn't have a basement because in North Carolina they don't usually have basements. And remember just laying in there hearing all this howling and howling outside for what seemed like hours and hours. And when we finally came out, after we heard big crashes and we came out and there were these my parents' house was on a street that was a little it made like a little semicircle around a little park, and there were these two big trees in the park, and they just fell straight down and sliced someone's car in half that was still parked on the street, and that was really sad because it was a really nice looking convertible. And we came outside and we saw my friend's house. They had this real nice fireplace. Their chimney had been blown completely off, and also, we lived in a subdivision that had lakes. It was called Village Lakes, and it was a big deal because it had lakes. Except the people who lived on the third lake were getting screwed because their lake never filled with water, so they had paid for a lakefront home and got no lake out of the deal, which is a pretty raw deal. And it had flooded all the way up that their lake was finally lakefront property amongst the damage. So yeah, it was really freaky and surreal. So, for the first couple days, we tried to ride it out, and sort of not open the fridge much and hope our food didn't spoil and stuff like that. But after a while, we were just like, what are we going to do? There's no power. So we decided we couldn't really take it much longer. And we packed up our stuff and drove out to another metropolitan area, the High Point Greensboro area, which was about another hour and a half inland. And we found a hotel there and we stayed there for a few nights. And we just hung out in High Point and enjoyed the time there because my dad couldn't work, obviously, also because the power was out. And we just enjoyed our time there for a little while. And then we finally came back and we finally came home, and eventually they finally got the power on after 2 weeks. And it was, it's really interesting for me now being near an adult, and I see all these apocalypse films, that are like, what if the power went out? Would society crumble in like 3 hours or something? And, back then it didn't, but this was 1996, this was the internet just barely existed, but we didn't live our lives wholly dependent on computers still, I don't think as much. And I just don't know what people do when it's like that. Of course, I saw the chaos that ensued in New Orleans after Katrina, but that's sort of different, right? I mean, 80% of the city was totally underwater, so that explains a lot of the issue that was there. But I decided that it's just, I think what people don't understand, and I'll talk about this more later after I talk about what Hurricane Floyd was like, is that North Carolina is particularly different in the aspect that, it's used to getting hit with more hurricanes than Texas and Louisiana, but B, because of that, I think people didn't really settle as densely along the coastline because they're used to more hurricanes coming. It's not as many permanent settlements and structures. And I think that's why when even I know there are some people who did lose their lives in Florence, but that's why we're not talking about, you know, a scenario where Hurricane Katrina comes and there's thousands of people dead and stuff like that. It just doesn't. It's not going to be that way in North Carolina. So yeah. Anyway, so after experiencing Fran, I have to admit it was quite crazy. And then, of course, a professional hockey team moved to North Carolina from Hartford. They used to be called the Hartford Whalers, and they thought it was pretty funny to change their name and call themselves the Carolina Hurricanes. And they made their symbol this hurricane-like figure, and they had these storm flags with hockey sticks. It's very funny. I find it very charming. It's unfortunate that after they won their Stanley Cup, that the team has never been the same. But it's quite funny, and I remember enjoying their games very much as a kid, and going and watching hockey. So it's weird thinking of hockey in North Carolina, but it was a lot of fun. Yeah, so the next one I want to talk about is Hurricane Floyd. And Floyd also did some damage. The difference with Floyd, I think, was whereas Fran, yes, there was flooding associated with Fran. Floyd, Fran really actually had the strong winds. It actually hit with really powerful winds still when it was making landfall. And it really did just tore a bunch of stuff up with its strong winds. Whereas Floyd kind of is the scenario we're talking about with Hurricane Florence, except Floyd, in my opinion, was even stronger than that still. It it had it had some powerful winds, but the damage it caused was from just an extreme amount of rainfall and flooding. And we lost our power a little bit during Floyd too. I think it was like a week, but it was not as long because, again, like I said, the winds weren't that strong. But man, some of the cities only like an hour east of us, like Rocky Mount, they were just underwater. I mean, it just water fell and fell and fell, and it never seemed to recede. There was like places that they said were underwater for like a month. It just never receded. It was just an insane amount of water that just randomly seemed to fall, and it just I don't know what happened. I guess it's just it just rained and rained and rained, and it slowly moved on. But so yeah, I just remember reports that keep going around showing all these people just flooded out. It's constantly flooded out, and just lots and lots of water. And it was really ironic too, because then like 4 or 5 years after that in Raleigh, we were at a point where we were in a really bad drought. Yeah, can you imagine? So we go from having a lot of serious flooding, if you will, or yeah, just being completely drenched with water, to a point where we were so dry they were turning off fountains. They built a brand new mall in Raleigh at the time, and they turned off the fountain, and they were like, "Yeah, we can't keep the fountain on because we're dry," and that was just really weird. It was all very strange. Um, I guess extreme weather can happen anywhere. If that's something I've learned throughout my life, is that extreme weather always happens everywhere. But it was still quite nutso to see like these extremes happening in North Carolina. So anyway, next thing I want to talk about here is I'm going to transition into talking about why I think things aren't as bad as they could be with this Hurricane Florence in North Carolina. So North Carolina has a lot of big cities. I think it has it has 10 of its top 10. Yeah, its top 10 cities are over 100,000 people. Okay, but all of those cities are inland. Now, a lot of states are like that too. I mean, back in the day, Miami was the largest city in Florida. It's not anymore because of suburban development and things that have happened in Jacksonville and other places. But, you know, if you look at places like Florida and New York and Massachusetts and California, we generally think of large cities being on the coast. We think of most places being, it was a port developed into a large city, and there you go. North Carolina's weird because Wilmington is over 100,000 now, and it is one of the 10 largest cities, but it's never been the biggest or most important city in North Carolina. And back in the day, way back when North Carolina was a colony back in the day, New Bern was its capital, and that it was kind of important, But still, that's not even a straight up coastal city because it's inside the Outer Banks and you have to go through a sound to get there. And that's North Carolina's very strange that way. Its coastline doesn't really lend itself well to didn't really lend itself well to building a big port back in the day, and that's that may be part of the reason why the Roanoke colony failed. The lost colony of Roanoke. I don't know how many people know about that, but the English supposedly tried to set up a colony before Jamestown in North America in Roanoke, and nobody really knows what happened to the people that lived there. Uh, Most, I think, people agree now that it was probably them going off to live with the Indians and intermingling and becoming part of the native population. I would genuinely think that's probably what happened too. But so because of this, and so it's interesting because Virginia as well, another state with a lot with big development on the ocean front. Because of this, when a hurricane hits, I'm not saying it doesn't do damage. I'm not saying there's not people out there with permanent structures that are losing lots of money, and it's not tragic. But because of this, people forget that North Carolina is not like New Orleans or Houston or something. They're not up against there, so it's kind of hard to measure the impact because it's almost like cities like Raleigh and Charlotte and things, and even Fayetteville in Interstate 95. At any point, Interstate 95, the major north-south interstate there, it's from 80 to 120 miles inland. So it doesn't go out to these places. It doesn't go out along the Outer Banks and come in. So there's just not a lot of density out there. So it's like a giant buffer zone. Well, I don't want to say a buffer zone. That doesn't sound right. It's just a giant in between spot. So that's why you don't see the totals. I think people were expecting, like when the media was hyping up this Florence thing. And again, I'm not saying there isn't going to be damage and people didn't lose their lives, nothing like that. I'm not saying anything like that. But when they were hyping this up, they forget that there's just not a lot of density along there. There's just it's not going to impact on quite the level it did when it hit Houston or Louisiana. There's not as many people, so it's a different place. I really enjoyed my time living in North Carolina, but the one of the things you have to deal with living there is going to be hurricanes at some point, and especially if you live in eastern North Carolina, it's almost hard to you really wonder why some people put up with it, put up with trying to keep their permanent structures out there, knowing that they could have a Fran or a Floyd or a Florence come every 5 or so years. Now, back when I was a kid, it was really unusual that Fran and Floyd had hit so close together. But it's just hard, and that's probably why most people in North Carolina tend to live in the Charlotte or Raleigh Durham area, and they like it, and then they just go out and visit those beachy areas, on the weekend. So yeah, my heart goes out to everyone. I think the damage totals will not be quite as high as some other events, and hopefully North Carolina can keep the business flowing in the middle part of the state and help keep use that to sort of help keep Eastern North Carolina doing all the great things it does too. There are great things about it. There's Eastern Carolina University, very very nice college in a very small town, and New Bern was really interesting. Being an old state capital, it has Palace, and it's also where Pepsi Cola is from. And Wilmington's a really nice town. It has an Azalea Festival every year. So yeah, Eastern North Carolina. Some people really love it, and some of them tough it out. But it's a little bit too much for my blood. Anyway, thanks for listening, everyone. And this has been episode 32 of the Know Your Place podcast.